Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, let us slip backward in time past the cathedrals, past the silence of ruined castles, past the stories we like to romanticize about the age of chivalry. Let us step into the Middle Ages not as knights or queens, but as ordinary people walking through streets that smelled of smoke, sweat, and superstition. Because behind every legend we inherited from that thousand-year stretch of history, there was usually something unsettlingly real. We tend to picture medieval Europe as a theater of absurd beliefs, people blaming demons for disease, witches for weather, or saints for stomach aches. But what is both haunting and oddly human is how many of their urban legends began with a grain of truth. Underneath the miracles, curses, and ghost stories, there was often a body, a plague, a smell, a strange accident, something physical and real that their imagination simply stretched into meaning. That is what tonight's journey is about, the strange overlap between myth and fact. Not dragons or fairies, but real stories that the medieval mind turned into legend, because when you live in a world without science, storytelling becomes survival. The legends of the Middle Ages were not just entertainment. They were people trying to explain the chaos of their lives. Picture the world they lived in. Disease moved faster than armies. Lightning struck churches as often as barns. Crops failed with no warning. People buried their children, then prayed to saints they would never met, hoping one of them might care enough to stop the rain or the fever. When you live that close to the edge, mystery is not a luxury, it is the only language that makes sense. And that is why so many medieval urban legends sound half insane to us now: dancing plagues, bleeding bread, exploding bishops, and rats tied together by fate. Yet every one of them began with something tangible: a fungus. A chemical reaction, a natural phenomenon too strange to ignore. The line between superstition and science was so thin that sometimes even the truth looked miraculous. The Middle Ages were a time when ignorance did not mean stupidity, it meant trying to describe lightning before anyone had a word for electricity. It meant calling a disease possession because you could see its violence but not its cause. The people of that world were not foolish. They were improvising reality with the tools they had: prayer, rumor, and imagination. What makes their stories still magnetic is the way they reveal our own instincts hiding underneath. Even now, when something unexplained happens, lights in the sky, sounds in the dark, diseases we do not yet understand, our first impulse is to reach for story. We are not that different. We just have better vocabulary for our fears. Take, for example, the dancing plague of 1518, where hundreds of people in Strasbourg began to dance uncontrollably, collapsing from exhaustion. For centuries, it was told as proof of demonic possession or divine punishment. Today, historians trace it to ergot fungus, essentially accidental LSD in the town's bread. But the emotional truth remains the same: a community losing control of its body, its logic, its safety. What they experienced was hysteria, but also solidarity, hundreds of frightened people moving to the same invisible rhythm, because fear, like music, can be contagious. That is what gives medieval legends their weight. They are not just ridiculous superstitions. They are portraits of communities trying to survive chaos together. When an entire village saw the same miracle or the same hallucination, it meant that at least they were not alone in their confusion. And there is something strangely poetic in how they reacted. When a corpse exploded from trapped gases inside a sealed tomb, the story did not end with, "We should improve ventilation." It ended with, "God is punishing the greedy." It sounds naive, but it gave them a sense of moral order. If something awful happened, it was not random, it was a message. In a world full of random suffering, messages were a kind of mercy. Of course, not every legend came from fear. Some came from awe. Imagine standing in a stone church lit by candles, watching a communion wafer appear to bleed. You would not think about bacteria, you would think about the divine. The story spread across Europe, turning into proof that faith itself could be visible. It did not matter that science later discovered a red microbe growing on bread. For those who witnessed it, it was hope taking shape. And hope was something medieval people could not afford to waste. Their world did not have clear boundaries between natural and supernatural. The same priest who blessed your fields might also diagnose you with hot blood and prescribe dancing or bleeding as cure. The same farmer who salted his pork for winter might hang charms above the cellar to keep away demons. Practicality and mysticism lived in the same house. Sometimes in the same sentence. The legends that survived plagued doctors with bird masks, devils building bridges, saints healing wells, skeletons dancing through graveyards are not random. They are a collective diary of fear, survival, and imagination. They show us what people saw when they stared into the unknown and refused to look away. Take the Rat King, for example, a writhing knot of rodents fused by their tails, discovered in the dark corners of plague-struck cities. For centuries it sounded like myth, a grotesque metaphor for sin. But modern zoologists have found real specimens, proving the medieval eye was not always wrong, it just did not have the vocabulary to explain what it saw. The peasants did not invent monsters. Nature did. They just gave those monsters meaning. Or consider the Devil's Bridge, one of the most persistent legends across Europe. Villagers saw perfect stone arches spanning impossible gaps and could not believe human hands had built them. So they credited the devil, then tricked him by sending a goat across first to fulfill his contract. It is both hilarious and revealing. When you do not understand geometry, clever storytelling becomes architecture's twin. They did not fear the devil as much as they respected good craftsmanship. When you listen closely, you can hear their logic humming underneath the superstition. Every story, no matter how absurd, was an attempt to turn chaos into a system to say, if I understand this, maybe I can survive it. That is not ignorance. That is early science, still wrapped in faith and folklore. Even the most grotesque beliefs, the vampire corpses with bricks in their mouths, the wells bubbling from decapitated saints, were attempts to protect communities from invisible threats like contagion. Archaeologists now uncover those same burial sites and realize the villagers were not insane. They were making public health decisions with zero data and infinite fear. They did not call it infection control, but that is exactly what it was. So when we laugh at medieval legends, we are also laughing at ourselves in the dark, at our own desperate need to make sense of things before the evidence arrives. Whether it is aliens, conspiracies, or digital myths spreading through timelines, we are still medieval at heart. We still turn the unknown into story before we turn it into science. What makes these old tales worth revisiting is not just their weirdness, it is their honesty. They remind us that belief is not the opposite of intelligence. It is what we use when knowledge runs out. The people of the Middle Ages were not trapped by superstition. They were guided by imagination, trying to translate nature into meaning. And maybe that is why their world feels strangely familiar today. We live in an age that believes it is rational. Yet we still invent explanations for what frightens or confuses us. Our monsters wear different names: algorithms, outbreaks, systems we do not understand, but the instinct is the same: give it a story, and maybe it won't devour us. If you walked through a medieval market square and listened, you would hear gossip, prayers, and fear braided together in the same breath. Someone might whisper about a saint's well that heals wounds. Another about a plague doctor who smells like herbs and carries death in his shadow. Those stories filled the same role that podcasts, tweets, and late-night theories fill for us now. They made sense of the noise. The beauty of these legends is that they blur the border between madness and meaning. They show how easily truth and myth can trade places when people are desperate to understand the world. And in that way, the Middle Ages were not a dark age at all, they were an age of interpretation, where even the smallest mystery was treated like a message from the universe. So as we travel through these stories, the dancing plagues, the cursed bridges, the exploding bishops, remember that each one is more than superstition. It is a snapshot of how humans think when they are scared, imaginative, and profoundly alive. The people who believed these tales were not fools. They were survivors. Poets of disaster, turning horror into metaphor just to keep breathing. The next time someone calls the Middle Ages backward or ignorant, think of those villagers staring at something they could not explain and deciding to make it sacred instead of senseless. Think of how much courage it takes to live in a world of constant death and still create meaning. Because that is what every medieval legend truly was, a survival instinct disguised as faith. And when you strip away the saints, the curses, and the miracles, what is left is something achingly human, the need to believe that behind the chaos, there is still a pattern. That even the strangest, darkest stories might contain a piece of the truth. So dim the lights, let the world outside go quiet for a while, and let us wander together through the fog of medieval imagination. Tonight is not about monsters or miracles. It is about the people who invented both and how, in their confusion, they might have understood the world more deeply than we think. It began, like most madness, quietly. One summer morning in July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street in Strasbourg and started to dance. No music, no audience, no partner, just her feet slapping against cobblestones as though something inside her refused to stop. Neighbors watched, half curious, half horrified, as she twirled for hours. Then days. Then an entire week. At first, people thought she was possessed, cursed, or simply unwell. But then the strangest thing happened, others joined her. Men, women, even children began to dance in the same fevered rhythm, as if an invisible drum had seized control of the town. Within a few days, dozens filled the streets. Within weeks, hundreds. Contemporary reports describe as many as 400 people jerking and spinning without rest, collapsing from exhaustion, their bodies trembling even as they begged to stop. Modern historians call it the dancing plague, but to those living through it, it felt like divine punishment, or worse, divine amusement. The town's leaders, desperate for answers, turned to the only logic they knew, religious guilt. The priests decided the dancers had offended St. Vitus, the patron saint of dance, and that the only cure was pious suffering. Civic officials, perhaps fearing riots, took a different approach. They built a stage, hired musicians, and encouraged the dancers to keep going until the madness burned itself out. It was an astonishing mistake. Eyewitnesses claimed the music only made things worse. The rhythm drove the afflicted into greater frenzy. People collapsed from heat and dehydration, their feet bleeding, their hearts straining. Some died mid-step. Others were carried away only to return later, unable to resist. A scene meant for exorcism turned into something closer to spectacle, a tragic street performance where faith and ignorance collided under the summer sun. So what truly happened? Modern scholars have wrestled with that question for centuries, and no single explanation satisfies everyone. Some point to ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that infects rye bread, effectively dosing the entire town with a medieval version of LSD. Others believe it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, a collective panic triggered by stress, hunger, and trauma. Strasbourg, after all, had been battered by famine, disease, and relentless fear of divine wrath. People were starving, desperate, and psychologically fragile. In that context, the dancing makes a strange kind of sense. When your world is collapsing, the body finds its own language of release. What we might call madness could have been the only way these people could express grief or terror in a society where Confession was controlled by priests and medicine was ruled by superstition. There is a grim irony here. The same authorities who could have helped physicians, clergy, magistrates did not ask why people were dancing. They asked which sin had caused it. That is how you get public hysteria turned into a festival, with musicians playing as citizens convulse. The solution, they believed, was to sweat out the sickness. And so they danced until they could not. The chronicles from that summer are both comic and horrifying. A town literally danced itself toward death because no one could imagine that hysteria might have a physical cause. The medical texts of the time spoke of hot blood, divine punishment, and sinful indulgence. Even the rational minds of the day city officials believed they could fix the problem by organizing it. You can almost see the absurdity, hundreds of delirious people flailing while a hired band plays nearby. The sound of fiddles mixing with cries of exhaustion. And yet beneath the absurdity lies something hauntingly human. The dancing plague shows what happens when an entire community's anxiety finds a single outlet. The participants were not mad in the sense of insanity, they were overwhelmed. The famine, poverty, and relentless sermons about wrath and judgment had created a perfect storm of collective stress. The body revolted where the soul could not. The tragedy also marks one of the earliest documented cases of mass hysteria, centuries before psychology existed. It reminds us that panic is contagious, that fear can spread faster than any disease. The same nervous system that once made people dance in despair now makes crowds panic, markets crash, and rumors go viral. We have just changed the setting. Still, there is an odd beauty in the story. For all its chaos, it is also a glimpse of solidarity. Hundreds of people, bound by invisible suffering, moving together without words. If you strip away the terror, it is almost poetic, an entire town turning grief into motion. In a way, their collective breakdown was also a form of communion. By the time the madness ended, Strasbourg was exhausted. The authorities sent the survivors on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus, hoping the saint they had supposedly offended might show mercy. Those who could still walk made the long, blistering journey, praying, bleeding, stumbling. Eventually, the dancing stopped, the stages were dismantled, and the town fell silent again, at least outwardly. But the legend did not fade. For centuries, people told the story of the dancing curse, half amused, half terrified. It became one of those tales medieval Europe specialized in, absurd yet meaningful, grotesque yet revealing. The idea that joy and death could blur into the same motion said something essential about their world and ours. Because what the dancing plague really showed was the fragility of control. One moment, a city behaves as it should, orderly, devout, obedient. The next, it is spinning out of rhythm, unable to stop. The boundary between faith and fear, between devotion and delirium, collapsed in those streets. Today, scientists can describe ergot alkaloids, serotonin responses, and psychosomatic triggers. But none of that fully explains why hundreds of people lost themselves to a rhythm only they could hear. Maybe it was not just chemistry. Maybe it was collective exhaustion, the soul's rebellion against constant terror. We like to think we have outgrown such hysteria, that our age of data and medicine has inoculated us against madness. But history whispers otherwise. People still move together under the spell of emotion, still surrender logic to fear, still follow rhythms they do not understand. Only now the music comes from screens, headlines, or belief systems that promise safety. Strasbourg's dancers were just an earlier version of us, caught in a feedback loop of panic and hope. When you strip away the costumes and the cobblestones, the story becomes unsettlingly modern. A crisis hits, no one understands it, and instead of stopping to think, the crowd doubles down, building a stage, hiring musicians, turning suffering into spectacle. We have seen that pattern again and again. In politics, in media, in every moral panic that dances itself into exhaustion. Maybe that is why the legend endures. It is not just about medieval superstition, it is a mirror for every time humanity mistook frenzy for healing. The dancing plague was tragic, yes, but also deeply symbolic, a community spinning itself into collapse, believing movement could replace understanding. When the last dancer finally fell and the music stopped, Strasbourg returned to normal, which still meant famine, plague, and fear. But for a brief, delirious summer, the people of that city embodied something larger than disease or faith. They became the purest expression of medieval life, desperate, devout, and beautifully irrational. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them still, the faint echo of bare feet on stone, the rhythm of panic disguised as prayer. And the eternal heartbeat of a species that has never truly stopped dancing with its own fears. There are moments in history so absurd that they feel like satire. And yet, they are real. In 897 AD, the Catholic Church staged one of the strangest and most grotesque events ever recorded, the Cadaver Synod. Picture this: a pope, long dead and decomposing, dug up, dressed in full papal robes, and dragged into court to stand trial for his supposed crimes. It was not metaphor. It was not theater. It was vengeance wrapped in ceremony. The story begins with Pope Formosus, a man whose name now reads like an omen. During his lifetime, Formosus had been both respected and controversial. He navigated alliances between powerful kingdoms, blessed rival emperors, and made decisions that angered as many people as they helped. After his death, his enemies were not satisfied. Chief among them was Pope Stephen VI. His successor, furious, paranoid, and determined to erase his rival from both history and heaven. Stephen believed that Formosus had betrayed the church by accepting power he did not deserve. But resentment alone could not satisfy a mind like his. He wanted spectacle. So, months after Formosus was buried, Stephen ordered the corpse exhumed. The decomposed remains were propped on a throne in the Lateran Basilica, dressed in the fine robes of office, and given a mock trial before a panel of horrified clergy. It is hard to imagine the scene without feeling the chill. The air thick with incense, the flicker of torchlight revealing a shriveled, robed figure slumped on marble. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse to answer charges of perjury and ambition. The crowd watched in silence as Pope Stephen screamed accusations at the body, his rage echoing through the hall. It was not justice. It was theater. The verdict was preordained. Formosus was declared guilty. His papal vestments were torn off, his blessing fingers cut away, and the corpse was dragged through the streets before being tossed into the Tiber River. The image of it, holy robes drifting downstream, burned itself into medieval memory. And then, as if the world itself recoiled, the tide turned. The people of Rome erupted in outrage. Even the clergy, used to political games, could not stomach what they would see. Riots broke out. Within months, Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned and strangled to death in his cell. Justice, it seemed, had a dark sense of irony. What followed was a kind of collective embarrassment. Later popes quietly reburied Formosus, restoring his honor and pretending the trial had never happened. But history never forgets madness. The Cadaver Synod became a lasting symbol of how power can turn sacred institutions into stages for revenge. From a distance of more than 1,000 years, the event feels surreal. Yet it reveals something raw about the medieval world, a time when faith and politics were so entwined that vengeance could masquerade as theology. To a modern mind, the trial was lunacy. To those living then, it was divine order asserting itself through human fury. Pope Stephen was not the only one guilty of that confusion. The entire age was built on the idea that earthly power mirrored God's will. Kings ruled by divine right. Popes spoke as God's mouthpiece. So when ambition, jealousy, or paranoia entered the picture, it did not feel like sin, it felt like destiny correcting itself. Stephen was not just attacking Formosus. He was purging heaven's hierarchy in his own image. But even within that logic, the cadaver synod crossed a line. It exposed how fragile that divine order really was, how easily it could rot. Like the body it dragged before the altar. The spectacle stripped the church of its mystique. Behind the robes and relics stood men as flawed, fearful, and vindictive as any monarch. Historians have since tried to explain Stephen's motives. Some say he was pressured by the powerful Spoleto family, whose influence over Rome wove politics and religion into one tangled web. Others argue that Stephen was mentally unstable, undone by the very authority he held. But maybe the truth is simpler. Power, when it is absolute, often breeds theater. And Stephen's stage was the pulpit. In medieval Europe, where most people could not read and politics was performed through ritual, such spectacles mattered. Every sermon, coronation, and punishment was a visual story. The cadaver synod was not just punishment, it was propaganda. A warning that even death could not protect one from the church's judgment. But the effect backfired. The more the church tried to appear infallible, the more human it looked. The trial revealed a grotesque vulnerability. The institution that claimed to mediate between heaven and earth could still descend into farce. You can sense the unease that lingered afterward. Chroniclers wrote about it in tones of disbelief. Priests who'd attended whispered about the stench, the horror of the corpse's vacant eyes. Rome, already a city of ruins, gained one more ghost, an image of sacred authority turning on itself. And in that image lies the deeper truth of the Middle Ages. The people who watched were not simply entertained or horrified. They were reminded that even holiness could decay. That corruption did not just live in palaces and battlefields, it sat on thrones draped in silk, speaking the language of God. If the dancing plague revealed the body's madness, the cadaver synod exposed the soul's. Both were expressions of chaos disguised as order, one born of fear, the other of pride. Together they mark a pattern that would repeat throughout medieval history, the need to find meaning even in madness, to turn breakdown into ritual. When Stephen screamed at that corpse, he was also screaming at himself, at the instability of power, at the terror of being forgotten. The church in that era was haunted by mortality, its buildings crumbled. Its leaders died young, its faith constantly tested by plague, heresy, and politics. To command a corpse was, in a way, to defy death. It was Stephen's attempt to prove that the institution, unlike its members, could not decay. But time had other plans. Within a year, Stephen's own body was rotting in the same earth as the man he condemned. And centuries later, both names survive not as saints, but as reminders of what happens when faith becomes theater and revenge wears the mask of righteousness. There is a dark symmetry to it. The cadaver synod began as a spectacle meant to humiliate a dead man. It ended as a parable that humiliated the living. When people call the Middle Ages dark, they often mean ignorant or cruel. But maybe dark also means something else, the willingness to look at horror and still frame it with ceremony. To turn even corruption into a kind of ritual performance. The people of that time understood something we often forget. That beneath the robes, titles, and sermons, every institution, no matter how holy, is made of human hands. And those hands can tremble, or strike, or desecrate. So the next time history feels absurd, remember Rome in 897, the basilica lit with torches, a corpse on trial, and a crowd holding its breath as a living pope shouted into the silence of the dead. It was not just madness. It was a mirror. If the dancing plague showed how the body could betray the living, and the cadaver synod showed how the living could betray the dead, then the next chapter of medieval madness takes us into a place stranger still where corpses themselves seem to revolt. It sounds grotesque, but in medieval Europe, death did not mean quiet. Sometimes, it meant spectacle. A saint's body might ooze sweet-smelling oil. A sinner's might bloat, burst, or bleed long after burial. To the medieval mind, these were not just natural processes, they were messages. Let us start with a familiar image, a cathedral in midsummer. Thick air, candle smoke, and the faint odor of incense barely masking something sour. Inside, a bishop lies in state, embalmed poorly and sealed in heavy vestments. The body swells, gases build, and then an eruption. The tomb leaks. The air fills with the smell of decay. To us, it is biology. To them, it was God speaking through flesh. They called it divine judgment. When a corpse split or bled, it was proof of sin or corruption. If the body stayed fresh, it was a sign of sanctity. It did not matter that temperature, humidity, and preservation were the real causes. Medieval Europe did not separate the spiritual from the physical. Both were woven into the same fabric. A body did not decompose, it testified. The stories multiplied. Chronicles tell of bishops who exploded during funerals, of abbots whose bodies ran with dark fluid after death, and of crowds taking this as proof that God himself had rejected them. Churches would close their tombs or move them outside to stop the contagion of sin. Even more mysterious were the bleeding wafers the Eucharistic host said to ooze blood when pierced or dropped. In a time when belief in the real presence of Christ in the bread was central to faith, such stories carried enormous weight. Pilgrims would travel for miles to see them, to touch the sacred cloths, to weep at what they believed was living proof of the divine. Of course, the truth was simpler and stranger. Modern science later identified the culprit, Serratia marcescens, a red pigmented bacterium that can grow on damp bread, producing what looks eerily like fresh blood. To the medieval eye, it was a miracle. To ours, a microbial coincidence. But it is worth pausing before we laugh. Because what people saw was not just a trick of nature, it was the shape of their yearning. They wanted evidence that faith was real, that heaven still had skin in the game. In a world where famine, war, and plague made God feel distant, a bleeding wafer was a sign that he had not forgotten them. And maybe, in their own way, they were right. Not about the miracle itself, but about the impulse behind it. Humans need symbols that touch the senses. It is not enough to believe. We want to see belief bleed. In those centuries, almost anything that defied explanation became holy or cursed. Wax melting into strange shapes could be a prophecy. A sudden rain after prayer was proof of sainthood. A decaying corpse that refused to smell was declared incorrupt. And in all of it, there was one constant: the body was the battleground between salvation and sin. Think about what it meant to live surrounded by the dead. Cities did not have cemeteries outside town walls yet. People were buried beneath churches, in crypts, in walls. The air itself carried the memory of mortality. Every mass, every incense cloud, was layered over the scent of decomposition. No wonder people thought the dead still spoke. They did through smell, sound, and sight. It is easy to imagine a medieval night when the line between life and death blurred. A monk tending candles near a tomb hears a soft pop air escaping from a decaying body. He sees a dark stain spreading across marble, like fresh blood. Fear and reverence mingle. He falls to his knees. By morning, the story is spreading, the Lord has revealed his anger. Soon the tale travels by pilgrim and parchment, changing shape as it goes. One village's rotting corpse becomes another's bleeding saint. Truth dissolves into pattern. The church, aware of the power of wonder, leans into it. Relics multiply. So do processions, indulgences, and holy sites. Each miracle brings pilgrims, and pilgrims bring offerings. Faith becomes an economy of hope, fear, and spectacle. But what is fascinating is not the fraud. It is the sincerity. Most people believe completely. The miracle was not just an event, it was a form of conversation between heaven and earth. To them, the natural and the supernatural were not opposites. They were layers of the same story. And when you strip away the theology, what is left feels strangely familiar. We still do this: turn coincidence into sign, biology into meaning. A shadow on a wall becomes a ghost. A cloud shaped like a heart becomes love returned. The instinct has not changed. Only the vocabulary has. In medieval Europe, people lived in a state of constant dialogue with their environment. Disease, rot, and decay were not hidden away. They were reminders of divine justice and fragile grace. Their world was smaller, harsher, and somehow more intimate with death. Every miracle, every horror, was proof that the universe still noticed them. You can almost see the scene: villagers gathered around a church altar, eyes wide, whispering prayers as the priest lifts a blood-stained wafer into the air. The air thick with awe and dread. In that moment, belief did not need proof. The proof was belief itself. Centuries later, when science unraveled the mysteries behind these miracles, the emotional truth remained. Those bleeding hosts, those swelling corpses, were part of a language the medieval world used to talk about guilt, redemption, and decay. They turned biology into theology because that was the only vocabulary they had for all. The modern mind calls it superstition. But maybe it was just a different kind of literacy, one that read nature as scripture. If you stand inside an old cathedral today, surrounded by tombs, you can still feel traces of that language. The air is heavy, almost alive. Light filters through stained glass like blood through skin. Every sound echoes against centuries of faith and fear. You can understand why people once believed the walls themselves could weep. The Middle Ages were not just an age of ignorance, they were an age of interpretation. Every crack, every scent, every stain meant something. The world was not random. It was personal. And if a corpse burst open or a wafer bled, it only confirmed what everyone secretly knew, that the divine was watching, even when it hurt. So, the next time someone calls those stories foolish, think of what they were really saying: that the human body, alive or dead, was not just flesh. It was evidence. And maybe, beneath all the horror, that is the most haunting idea of all. If you were a peasant in the 13th century, life did not give you many certainties. You could count on hunger. You could count on winter. You could count on death arriving too early. But the one thing that promised stability, the one thing that made the world feel anchored, was the church. The Eucharist, that small white wafer raised in a priest's hand each Sunday, was not just bread. It was mystery made visible. To believe it became flesh was to believe that heaven could touch you. So imagine the shock when one day, in some quiet chapel, the bread began to bleed. It happened often enough to make history. In towns from Bohemia to Italy, people claimed that when a priest broke the host during Mass, blood welled up between his fingers. Sometimes it dripped onto the altar. Sometimes it seeped through cloth. In a few stories, the entire wafer transformed into a fragment of human flesh. To the faithful, it was proof of the miracle they had always hoped was real. The doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread and wine literally became Christ's body and blood, was impossible to prove, yet demanded total belief. The bleeding host seemed to end the debate. Faith no longer needed imagination. It had evidence. The church, unsurprisingly, leaned in. These stories spread like fire. Shrines were built. Pilgrimages organized. The miracle wafers were preserved in crystal containers, carried through cities in solemn processions. Songs were written. The message was clear: doubt not, for God had shown his presence in the simplest of forms. What the pilgrims did not know was that something else was alive in those wafers, a bacterium. Centuries later, scientists discovered Serratia marcescens, a red pigmented microbe that thrives on damp flour or bread, especially in humid church cellars. It produces a striking crimson stain that looks exactly like blood. To the medieval world, which had no concept of microorganisms, it was as if the divine had chosen to speak in color. It is easy, now, to reduce the story to chemistry. Bread plus moisture plus time equals miracle. But that misses the real point. The miracle was not just the red stain, it was what the red stain meant to the people who saw it. They did not mistake science for God. They turned mystery into intimacy. In a world that rarely gave them tenderness, the idea that God would bleed for them again and again in their own village, on their own altar, was overwhelming. Faith was not abstract. It was visceral. It touched the tongue, it colored the cloth, it smelled of iron and all. And here's the strange truth. Those miracles, though biologically explainable, kept communities alive. They gave people something to believe in when plagues and wars hollowed out their hope. The pilgrimages that followed were not just about worship, they were about connection. People traveled miles to see the miraculous hosts, carrying their sick, their children, their prayers. Entire economies grew around them: inns, markets, relic sellers, storytellers. A tiny microbe had accidentally become one of Europe's most successful tourism campaigns. But beneath the bustle lay something softer. The miracle of the bleeding host answered a wound deeper than theology. It was about presence. In an age where life was fragile and invisible forces, plague, famine, sin ruled the imagination, this was proof that something invisible was also with them. That the sacred was not locked away in heaven, but literally here on the altar, in their mouths, staining their hands. The emotional logic was perfect. The world bled. So did God. And yet, not every miracle was embraced. Some were met with fear. The line between divine sign and demonic trick was razor thin. A bleeding host could mean faith rewarded or faith corrupted. The church, careful to guard its monopoly on mystery, launched inquiries. Bishops examined the stains. Some miracles were declared genuine. Others condemned as frauds or heresies. There were even cases where Jews were falsely accused of stabbing hosts in mockery, leading to brutal persecutions. In that way, what began as awe sometimes ended as cruelty. Wonder, in the wrong hands, became weapon. Still, the idea of a living, bleeding God refused to fade. It reappeared in art and mysticism. Medieval painters began depicting the Eucharist as a radiant heart. Visionary nuns described seeing drops of blood fall from the host into the chalice. The border between hallucination, faith, and metaphor dissolved. Centuries later, when scientists finally identified Serratia marcescens under a microscope, the discovery did not kill the legend, it only reframed it. What the Middle Ages called miracle, we call phenomenon. But the impulse behind it remains the same, the hunger for meaning that can be touched. You could argue that the real miracle was not the bleeding bread at all, but the way people's hearts responded to it with fear, devotion, poetry, even greed. The same crimson stain inspired both cathedrals and witch hunts. It revealed, better than any sermon, how faith and doubt feed on the same longing, to feel seen by something larger than ourselves. And that is why this story still feels alive. We might not kneel before a wafer anymore, but we still chase signs of face in the clouds. A number repeating, a coincidence that feels too sharp to ignore. We still want the universe to show its hand. The bleeding bread of God is gone, but its echo lingers in every time we mistake the natural for the meaningful, and find comfort in the mistake. Maybe that is what belief really is, not ignorance, but the courage to treat mystery as conversation. In the candlelit silence of those medieval chapels, when the faithful knelt before a red-stained wafer, they were not fools, they were human beings aching to see love made visible. And whether that redness came from heaven or from a bacterium did not matter. For them, for that moment, it was holy. And in a world as uncertain as ours, it is hard not to understand the impulse. In the dim corners of medieval houses, behind barrels, beneath floorboards, inside barns, you could hear them. The scratching, the squealing, the frantic rustle of tails. Rats were everywhere, in bread bins, in hay, in dreams. They were not just pests. They were a sign. To the people of the Middle Ages, rats were living proof that sin had a smell. When plague came, rats came too. When grain rotted, rats were first to feast. They moved through the world like tiny omens, always near suffering but never suffering themselves. And sometimes, when the world seemed especially cursed, villagers would find something worse than a single rat, a rat king. The first known mention came from Germany, though stories spread across Europe. A rat king was a knot of rats found fused together at the tails, tangled, sticky, alive or dead. A single creature made of many bodies, twisting as one. Imagine stumbling upon that in your cellar, a clump of matted fur. 20 eyes shining, limbs pulling in different directions but never breaking free. To a medieval farmer, that was not biology. That was evil manifest. They called it an omen of plague, a punishment from God, or a curse that appeared before great disaster. Chroniclers swore that a rat king's discovery meant famine or death within weeks. The image was so grotesque it became a kind of folk theology, proof that corruption could physically bind creatures together. What they did not know was that these monstrosities were not inventions of fear. They were real. Modern zoologists have found preserved rat kings' bodies of small rodents joined at the tails by dirt, blood, sap, or frozen excrement. It can happen when young rats, huddling for warmth, get their tails coated in sticky substances and then freeze or dry into a single mass. When they grow, they pull against each other but can't separate. The result is a tragic knot of life, doomed to move only as one creature. It is disturbing, but also deeply symbolic. The medieval imagination was not wrong to see meaning there. They just chose a different vocabulary. Where we see a rare natural accident, they saw a mirror of their world, bodies bound by suffering, unable to escape the contagion of sin. During plague years, when corpses piled faster than graves could hold them, the rat king became the perfect metaphor. People saw themselves in those creatures tied together by disease and fear, struggling toward a light they could not reach. In taverns and sermons alike, the image spread: when rats join, the world sickens. Rat kings entered art, rumor, and religious writing. Illustrations showed them surrounded by skulls, tails braided like rope. Priests warned parishioners that the devil knots beasts as he knots hearts. Some villagers burned any they found, believing the smoke would cleanse the air. Others displayed them like trophies, proof of vigilance against darkness. The church, unsurprisingly, found theological uses for the image. Preachers spoke of spiritual rat kings' souls entangled by greed and envy. The metaphor was irresistible, sin as glue, human weakness as a tail too easily caught. Medieval morality loved turning nature into parable, and this one came ready-made. Centuries later, scientists examining preserved rat kings in museums, some still intact, hardened into macabre sculptures, realized how much truth had been hiding inside superstition. The creatures were real, but their meaning was borrowed from human pain. Nature had accidentally staged a sermon. There is something strangely beautiful about that. The medieval mind was not ignorant, it was poetic. When people saw something horrific, they did not deny it or dissect it. They translated it. Horror became metaphor. In the Rat King, they found a kind of accidental art, a visual for what it meant to live trapped by forces beyond control. And maybe that is why the story still feels relevant. Because the image of tangled rats, struggling but inseparable, still fits us. We too live in systems that bind, in crises that link us whether we like it or not. Our plagues just change names: misinformation, addiction, fear. We are still moving as a mass, tugging against each other while sharing the same fate. When historians read medieval chronicles about rat kings, they often find a mix of disgust and fascination. But you can feel the sympathy, too. Those writers were not just describing monsters, they were confessing something. To live in the Middle Ages was to live entangled, in superstition, in faith, in survival. Everyone depended on everyone else. The plague proved it. The market proved it. Even sin was communal. So when they found a clump of rats bound forever together, it felt like recognition. Like the earth itself was saying, you are not alone in your misery. If you visit certain natural history museums today, you can still see these grim relics, rat kings preserved in glass, their bodies darkened by time. They look almost sculptural, like symbols carved by accident. And if you stand there long enough, watching the tiny bones locked together, you might feel what those medieval witnesses felt: awe, disgust, and an odd sense of kinship. Because in the end, that is what their legends always do, they turn fear into reflection. What terrified them most was not rats or plague. It was the idea that suffering might have no meaning. So they made meaning anyway. They turned chaos into symbol, pain into pattern, and gave even horror a reason to exist. The Rat King, tangled and tragic, was never just about vermin. It was about all of us bound together in our struggle to move through a world that never fully lets us go. There is a hill in North Wales where mist gathers like memory. Beneath it lies a pool of clear, bubbling water that has drawn pilgrims for nearly 1,000 years. To the modern visitor, it is quiet, just the soft sound of flowing spring, the smell of moss. The stone walls still slick with time. But for the medieval faithful, this place was proof that holiness could erupt from the earth itself. They called it a St. Winfried's well, and its story began, like many miracles, with violence. Winfried was said to be a young woman of noble birth, devoted to God. One day, a local prince named Caradog fell in love with her, or rather, decided to possess her. When she refused his advances and fled toward the church where her uncle, a monk named Buno, was preaching, Caradog chased her down and struck off her head. The head rolled down the hill, came to rest at Buno's feet, and from the ground where it fell, a spring burst forth, cold and bright. Buno picked up the head, placed it back upon the body, and prayed. Winfried rose, alive again, a white scar circling her neck. The spring, now holy, never stopped flowing. For medieval pilgrims, this was not just a story. People came from across Britain to bathe in the water, drink from it, or carry it home in vials. Crutches and bandages were left behind as offerings. Those who could not walk were lowered into the pool on ropes, praying that the chill would jolt life back into their limbs. The well became known as the Lord of Wales, long before Lord existed. Kings visited. Nobles funded chapels. Priests recorded testimonies of cures, blindness healed, wounds closed, fevers gone. To medieval minds, it was a place where heaven and soil had merged. Modern science, of course, offers another view. The spring sits atop a geological fault rich in minerals iron, sulfur, and calcium carbonate, all known to have mild healing properties. In other words, the water really did make some people feel better. It could ease skin conditions, soothe inflammation, and perhaps even improve mood through trace chemistry. But in a world without medical vocabulary, mineral therapy was indistinguishable from grace. The miracle was real, just translated differently. There is something deeply moving in that. The villagers did not build their faith in defiance of reality, they built it around what reality gave them. A natural spring became sacred not because it defied nature, but because it revealed it. The miracle was not that water flowed, but that it never stopped. In an age when everything was fragile, life, crops, peace, permanence itself felt divine. To visit St. Winfried's well in the 13th century was to enter a world humming with layers of meaning. The air thick with candle smoke, the water shimmering in torchlight, pilgrims murmuring prayers in half a dozen languages. The well was both physical and symbolic, a wound that never healed and never dried. And beneath all that reverence lay something even more intimate. The story of a woman's body reclaimed. In an era that often treated female virtue as property, Winfried's legend turned violation into resurrection. Her death birthed a spring. Her defiance reshaped the land. Every drop of that water was a reminder that purity was not submission, it was endurance. For the medieval faithful, such stories were not superstition. They were blueprints for survival. Life was brutal, unpredictable, full of loss. The idea that suffering could be transformed into blessing gave people a map through chaos. The well was not just holy, it was hopeful. And hope had architecture. By the 15th century, masons had built a stunning Gothic structure around the spring, a vaulted chapel with delicate tracery, carved stone ceilings, and steps leading down into the pool. Pilgrims knelt at the edge, their reflections wavering in the water like prayers made visible. Priests anointed them, whispering the same legend of blood that became water, of pain that became proof. Even today, the water still runs at the same temperature, the same clarity. Centuries of pilgrims have changed, but the rhythm has not. You can still lower your hand into that pool and feel what they felt, a shock of cold, then calm. Science might say you are touching mineral-rich groundwater. Faith says you are touching the echo of a miracle. Both are true, depending on which language you choose. And maybe that is the quiet genius of medieval spirituality. It did not divide the world into sacred and secular. It saw meaning in the mineral, mercy in the mud. When a spring erupted from a hillside, people did not call it coincidence, they called it conversation. The earth was alive, and holiness was simply its heartbeat. There is a tenderness in that worldview we have mostly lost. Today we demand proof. They sought pattern. We call things just geology, as if geology were not already a kind of grace. The story of St. Winfried's well reminds us that miracles often start as attention, someone noticing what others ignore. A trickle of water. A shimmer of light. The persistence of something beautiful in a brutal world. For the pilgrims who walked barefoot across mountains to reach that spring, it was not about evidence. It was about contact. To bathe there was to borrow courage from the earth itself, to feel that maybe the ground beneath your feet remembered mercy better than men did. And maybe that is why the story still flows. Because no matter how rational we become, there is a part of us that still kneels by the water, hoping it knows our names. By the dawn of the 14th century, few institutions in Europe were as wealthy or as feared as the Knights Templar. They had begun as monks with swords, guardians of pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, but over 2 centuries they became bankers, landowners, and political brokers. They built fortresses that dwarfed castles, held treasures no one could tally, and answered only to the Pope. For kings, that was both useful and terrifying. And in the medieval world, fear was a debt no one forgave. The man who finally broke the Templars was King Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, handsome, ambitious, and perpetually broke. His wars with England and Flanders had drained his treasury, and his appetite for luxury outpaced his gold. The Templars, meanwhile, were rich beyond measure. They would invented early banking systems, lent money to nobles, and even stored royal treasures in their Paris headquarters. To Philip, they looked less like holy warriors and more like a private empire hiding behind a cross. So he did what kings often do when power and debt collide: he created a crime. In 1307, on a Friday the 13th, a date that would later take on its own superstition, Philip ordered the mass arrest of every Templar in France. At dawn, soldiers stormed their commanderies, dragging men from beds, cells, and chapels. The charges were sensational: heresy, idol worship, sodomy, spitting on the cross, secret initiation rites. To the faithful, it sounded like blasphemy. To Philip, it sounded like justification. Under torture, confessions poured in. Some Templars admitted to denying Christ. Others described bowing before a mysterious head, sometimes said to be a skull, sometimes a demon called Baphomet. The truth was less theatrical. Pain makes anyone say anything, but the damage was done. The Church, caught between loyalty to the order and fear of scandal, began to crumble. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was imprisoned for 7 long years before being led to the stake in 1314. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that as the flames rose, he called out not in terror, but in prophecy, that both the king and the Pope Philip and Clement V, who had allowed the trials, would die within the year. They did. The Pope died a month later, possibly from illness. The king followed within the year, thrown from his horse during a hunt. And with their deaths, a legend was born. The curse of the Templars. It is hard to say what people really believed. Some took it as divine justice, others as coincidence, others as proof that the Templars had possessed powers even in death. What is certain is that it stuck. For centuries afterward, every misfortune in the French royal line was whispered to trace back to that curse. When the last Capetian king, Louis XVI, went to the guillotine during the French Revolution, some onlookers claimed to hear echoes of de Molay's prophecy fulfilled. The Templars themselves were erased, or rather, scattered. Their lands were seized, their wealth absorbed, their name defamed. But legends do not die when their owners do. The more the Church tried to bury them, the more mythic they became. In the centuries that followed, stories of hidden Templar treasure spread from France to Scotland to Jerusalem. People claimed the order had secret knowledge, relics from Solomon's Temple, the Holy Grail, lost Gospels. In paintings and pulpits alike, they morphed from soldiers to symbols, martyrs of faith, keepers of forbidden truth, precursors to secret societies. The truth is likely simpler, but no less haunting. The Templars were victims of politics masquerading as piety. Their fall exposed a brutal truth about medieval religion: it was not just about heaven. It was about power. Philip's campaign was propaganda. Perfected: accuse your creditors of heresy, seize their assets, and wrap it all in divine language. The Church played along, partly out of fear, partly out of convenience. The same institution that had once blessed the Templars' swords now blessed their executions. It was a lesson Europe never forgot: even holiness could be nationalized. Yet the legend endures because it speaks to something deeper than money or monarchy. It is about betrayal dressed in ritual. About faith consumed by politics. The Templars became what every fallen power hopes to become: myth instead of memory. Even today, their symbols linger: the Red Cross, the sealed horse, the silent brotherhood. Every generation resurrects them: writers, filmmakers, conspiracy theorists, each trying to fill the gap between what was real and what was lost. The idea that a group of disciplined men might have carried secret wisdom through centuries is irresistible. It flatters our hunger for continuity, for hidden order beneath chaos. But perhaps the real secret was not buried in treasure. It was in the story itself: how easily faith can be turned into a weapon, and how long vengeance can echo. In that sense, Jacques de Molay's curse feels less like mysticism and more like observation. He did not need supernatural power to doom his accusers. He understood something timeless: that injustice has a way of haunting those who profit from it. Every age finds its own version of Philip. A ruler who calls greed necessity, who turns purity into performance. And every age finds its de Molay, someone who dies for believing that loyalty should mean something. When we talk about the curse of the Templars, maybe what we are really naming is memory itself, the way the past refuses to stay buried when it is built on betrayal. The medieval world gave that memory the shape of prophecy because it did not have another language for poetic justice. We call it history. They called it a curse. And maybe they were not wrong. Because centuries later, the flames that consumed Jacques de Molay are still burning quietly in our imagination, lighting the same question his execution left behind. What happens when those who serve faith are destroyed by those who claim to defend it? The answer, it seems, is that they become legend. Picture a narrow street in 14th century Europe. The air is thick with rot and prayer. Doors are marked with chalk crosses. Bells toll without pause. A man walks by, wrapped in waxed leather from head to toe. His mask ends in a long curved beak stuffed with herbs. Children hide. Adults cross themselves. Death has a costume now, and this is it. That figure, half priest and half crow, became the most recognizable symbol of the Black Death, the pandemic that erased nearly half of Europe. But the plague doctor's outfit was not meant to frighten. It was meant to protect. In the absence of germ theory, people thought disease traveled through miasma, bad air thick with sin and decay. The beak acted as a crude filter, filled with lavender, cloves, mint, even vinegar-soaked sponges. Breathing through that scented tunnel was supposed to cleanse the breath of pestilence. The rest of the outfit followed the same logic. Leather coat, gloves, boots, all sealed tight with wax so no deadly air could touch the skin. A wide-brimmed hat marked the doctor's authority. A wooden cane allowed him to prod patients from a distance, an early, if unkind, form of social distancing. It looked like superstition, but it was primitive science. An experiment in isolation and barrier protection, centuries before microscopes would justify the idea. And for a while, people believed in it. When plague hit a town, everyone else fled, the wealthy to country estates, the clergy to higher ground. The ones who stayed were these masked doctors, many of whom were not doctors at all. Some were volunteers, barbers, apothecaries, or opportunists chasing hazard pay. City councils hired them under grim contracts: record the dead, drain the boils, and if you survive, we will pay your widow. Imagine the daily rhythm: sunrise over silent streets, the rattle of carts carrying corpses, the soft scrape of the doctor's stick against shutters. Inside, a family waits, hoping the figure at the door brings healing, not a tally mark. When he bends over the sick, his own reflection stares back from the curve of the glass lenses. Every breath smells of spice and fear. He lances the swollen buboes with his scalpel, sprinkles vinegar, murmurs a prayer he barely believes. He moves on. Behind him, another house closes its shutters for good. In time, the beaked mask became shorthand for the plague itself. To see one on the horizon was to know the city was doomed. Yet even in that terror, there was awe. These men, clumsy, unlucky, half-trained, were still the only ones walking toward death while everyone else ran away. Their bravery, or madness, left an imprint deeper than medicine. When Renaissance artists later painted the plague, they made the doctor part of the landscape, a dark bird stalking through light. To them, he embodied both science and superstition, hope and horror. The beak became the nose of reason sniffing at faith's decay. Centuries passed, and historians began to doubt whether the costume even existed in the worst years of the Black Death. Some claimed it was invented later, during the 17th century's lesser outbreaks in Italy and France. But then, documents surfaced, contracts describing Medici della Peste paid by city councils, sketches showing the very outfit we recognize today. The nightmare was real. The suit did not save them. Plague doctors died in staggering numbers, their leather soaked with the same infected fluids they hoped to repel. Still, their myth endured. The image spread faster than any cure, a silhouette with a bird's face standing in a sea of grief. It is easy to mock the design now, to call it ignorance. But if you look closer, the logic was not far off. They were trying to build distance, to filter air, to separate the living from the dying. It was science without tools, guesswork made tangible. And in its way, that is the story of every age that faces something it can't yet name. The mask, grotesque as it was, carried a strange grace. It allowed people to look at death without seeing a human face behind it. For the sick, that anonymity was mercy. For the doctor, it was armor for the soul. By the 18th century, the costume faded away, replaced by cleaner hospitals and the slow birth of modern medicine. But the symbol outlived the profession. It became art, carnival, warning. The beak mask appeared on theater stages, in Venetian parades, in paintings of morality and madness. Each generation turned it into something new, a joke, a costume, a ghost. Today, it surfaces again whenever the world feels fragile. During modern pandemics, people post its image online, half in fear, half in fascination. It is a reminder that our ancestors fought invisible enemies with whatever scraps of reason and faith they had. The plague doctor was their attempt at control in a time when control was impossible. And maybe that is why he still haunts us. Because deep down, we recognize him. Behind our masks and gloves and disinfectant, we are still trying to bargain with the air. To make sense of suffering that does not. He was never just a doctor. He was the medieval soul, stitched in leather, staring into chaos and daring to breathe. By the time the Black Death loosened its grip, Europe was changed forever. Entire towns had vanished. Priests had buried more neighbors than they could bless. Every church bell sounded like a reminder that life was both brief and brittle. Out of that exhaustion, something extraordinary bloomed, a new kind of honesty about death. It began, strangely enough, with art. On the walls of cemeteries and chapels, painters started covering plaster with scenes no one had dared to imagine before, skeletons in motion. Some led kings by the hand. Others danced beside peasants, bishops, even children. Skulls grinned through cracked jaws while bones twirled in tattered robes. The message was plain enough that even the illiterate could read it: death comes for everyone, and it never forgets to bring music. They called it la danse macabre, the dance of death. The idea was both grim and freeing. For centuries, Medieval society had been obsessed with hierarchy, kings above knights, knights above merchants, merchants above peasants. The dance of death erased the latter in one swift gesture. Every skeleton looked the same. No crown, no coin, no prayer could change the choreography. These murals and carvings spread like wildfire across Europe, from churchyards in France to frescoes in Germany, from cloisters in Spain to manuscripts in England. Sometimes they appeared beside pulpits. Sometimes above graves. Sometimes on the walls of hospitals where plague victims waited to die. The dance was not meant to scare. It was meant to level. In Paris, chroniclers wrote that people would gather after dark near the Cimetière des Innocents, where one of the earliest Danse Macabre murals appeared. Candlelight flickered across painted bones as musicians played nearby. It became both sermon and spectacle, a reminder that laughter and fear could share the same space. The tone of the artwork varied. Some skeletons played flutes and viols. Others dragged their partners by the hair. A few leaned in close, whispering secrets into the ears of bishops or lovers. Artists did not shy away from humor. Death might be cruel, but it also had impeccable timing. To the medieval mind, this was not blasphemy. It was clarity. Life was short, unpredictable, and often unfair. To dance with death was to admit the obvious, and in that honesty, to reclaim a little power. Writers soon joined the movement. Poets like Jean Gerson and John Lydgate wrote verses to accompany the murals, turning the skeletons into speakers of truth. I am death, one poem began, I spare no man. Yet the tone was not despairing. It was instructive. If everyone ends in the same place, the measure of a life is not wealth or lineage but how you treat others before the music stops. In this strange, morbid art, Europe found a philosophy. The dance of death turned trauma into ritual, fear into beauty. It was therapy painted in limestone. When people had no control over their fates, they painted control onto walls. And when you stare at those walls long enough, something happens. The terror softens into acceptance. A priest might have seen the murals as moral lessons. A peasant might have seen equality. A widow might have seen companionship, a reminder that the dead were only one step ahead. Whatever the interpretation, the images offered company in grief. Death was not a faceless void. It was a dancing partner. Modern historians like to read symbolism into everything: politics, class, religion, and they are not wrong. But there is something simpler at work too. People needed to look death in the eye without flinching. The plague had made the grave a daily neighbor. Pretending it was not there felt foolish. So they made it visible, even beautiful. And the art evolved. By the 15th century, the dance of death appeared in printed books, woodcuts, and even stage plays. Actors dressed as skeletons, leading audiences through mock processions of kings and beggars. Towns turned mortality into performance. In a sense, the entire continent was learning to live with ghosts. Not everyone approved. Some church officials called the art indecent, too playful. With holy themes, too public with despair. But ordinary people ignored them. The church promised salvation later. The dance promised sanity now. To look at one of those murals today is to glimpse the medieval mind at its most unguarded. The bones do not frighten so much as they tease. You can almost hear the rhythm, the rustle of robes, the clatter of femurs, the laughter that only comes when you have lost too much to fear losing more. And there is a curious comfort in that. Because in a world where death was certain and medicine was guesswork, laughter became rebellion. To make jokes in the face of decay was not denial. It was endurance. If the plague doctor represented humanity's attempt to fight death, the dance of death represented its attempt to befriend it. The doctor wore armor. The dancer wore truth. Both were necessary, but only one could bring peace. Centuries later, during wars and pandemics, the imagery resurfaced on posters, in literature, in quiet jokes soldiers told each other. The skeleton remains a universal shorthand for mortality. But behind that grin, there is the same old message: equality, humility, and the small, stubborn joy of being alive while you can. When people in the 1400s walked past those painted bones on their way to market or mass, they were not being reminded to despair. They were being reminded to live. And that is the paradox at the heart of the dance of death. It was not about dying at all. It was about the freedom that comes from remembering you will. So the next time you see a skeleton carved into an old church wall or printed on a Halloween card, know that it is carrying a lineage older than fear. Those bones once taught a continent how to keep dancing when the world refused to stop ending. And somehow, centuries later, the music still plays. Venice in the 14th century was a city of contradictions, wealth and rot sharing the same air. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and decay through narrow alleys. Canals glittered under sunlight but reeked at night. The very beauty of the city seemed to lean toward sickness. When the plague arrived, it found the perfect stage. The dead piled up faster than priests could bless them. Graves overflowed. The lagoon islands, once quiet retreats, became open-air cemeteries. Men in masks carried carts of bodies to shallow pits. The living did not dare look too long. They knew they might be next. And then, one day, someone noticed something strange. In the burial grounds on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo, gravediggers whispered about corpses that did not stay still. Some looked disturbed, shrouds torn, jaws open as if gasping for air. Others had dark fluid around their mouths. Rumors spread that the dead were feeding. To modern ears, it sounds like panic. But to medieval Venetians, who believed disease moved through air and body alike, the idea made perfect sense. If illness spread after death, maybe the corpse was somehow still alive. Maybe it hungered. And so the legend of the vampire of Venice was born. The logic was both horrifying and heartbreakingly simple. When the plague came, bodies were buried quickly, often before decomposition began. A few days later, when someone reopened a pit to add new victims, they found bloated corpses. Gases had split burial cloths. Fluids had forced through the mouth and nose. To terrified eyes, it looked like chewing. To stop this feeding, gravediggers developed a ritual. They pried open the jaws of suspected vampires and stuffed bricks or stones into their mouths to block the breath of death. It was both medical superstition and public reassurance. Once the brick was in place, the dead were silent again. For centuries, that practice lived only in rumor. Then, in 2006, archaeology confirmed it. At Lazaretto Nuovo, researchers uncovered the remains of a woman buried among plague victims. She was about 60 years old, unusually old for the time. Between her teeth was a brick the size of her jaw. The discovery electrified historians. The tabloids called her La Vampira di Venezia, the vampire of Venice. Of course, science offered a calmer explanation. The brick was a plague precaution, not proof of the undead. But what mattered was that superstition had been real enough to leave a mark in the dirt. This was not a story from a novel or a film. It was the record of people trying to make sense of contagion with the tools they had: fear, faith, and imagination. To them, a corpse was not just an object. It was a potential source of danger. They would see neighbors die after attending funerals. They would watch plague spread through families faster than rats could run. It was not hard to believe that the dead themselves were exhaling death. The revenant breath, as it was called, was a theory of hygiene born out of horror. So they fought back with ritual. The brick was not a stake or a weapon. It was a prayer in stone, a way of saying, enough. Stop. If you strip away the superstition, what is left is empathy. They were not afraid of monsters. They were afraid of suffering that never seemed to end. They were afraid of disease that came back again and again, no matter how carefully they buried it. Still, the image lingers, a skull with a brick between its teeth, forever mid-bite. It feels like a metaphor for the era itself, civilization trying to silence its own terror. Venice, perhaps more than any other medieval city, lived on that edge between beauty and rot. It was a place of masks, of ceremony, of denial turned into art. Even the vampire legend fits the city's character, half myth, half performance. The people could not stop death, but they could choreograph it, turn it into something they could name. And naming it was a kind of power. That is why the story survived. It was not about a single woman buried with a brick. It was about a city that refused to let fear remain formless. The vampire became an idea, not a creature stalking the night, but the embodiment of contagion, guilt, and the thin line between reverence and panic. If you stand today on Lazaretto Nuovo, the wind off the lagoon still smells faintly of salt and earth. The burial pits are covered, grass pushing through the stones. Somewhere underfoot lies that skull, silent at last. What the Venetians did was not madness. It was mourning with rules. They did not understand infection. But they understood that grief, when left unchecked, eats at the living. So they gave it shape, sealed it with ritual, and moved on. The vampire of Venice reminds us that behind every legend is an ache for control. A longing to believe that fear can be buried if you press hard enough. And perhaps that is the real horror, not that people once feared the dead, but that the living keep finding ways to relive the same story. Because in the end, Venice did not create a monster. It simply built a myth out of survival. If you travel through the hills of Europe and France, Germany, Italy, even the Welsh countryside, you will find old stone bridges tucked into ravines and valleys. Many are narrow and steep, their arches impossibly precise. Moss grows over them now, and sheep wander across where once only pilgrims and traders passed. But nearly every one shares the same name: the Devil's Bridge. The story repeats with local flavor but the same bones. A builder, sometimes a monk, sometimes a poor farmer, sometimes an entire village, makes a deal with the devil. They need a bridge to cross a dangerous gorge, but the work is too hard, the rocks too heavy. The devil appears and offers help on one condition: the first soul to cross will belong to him. Desperate, the human agrees. When the bridge is finished, it is flawless, strong, elegant, defying the limits of human craft. And then, at the crucial moment, the clever builder sends a dog, a goat, or a rooster across first. The devil, bound by his own terms, takes the animal and vanishes in fury. It is a simple folktale, told to children for centuries. But behind the charm lies something revealing. Medieval Europe did not quite trust genius. When ordinary people saw something extraordinary, a bridge spanning a gorge, a cathedral vaulting skyward, a clock that ticked on its own, they reached for the same explanation. No human could have done this alone. There had to be help from something darker, something otherworldly. To them, skill looked suspiciously like sorcery. That suspicion came from both awe and fear. The Middle Ages were an age of faith, yes, but also of boundaries. Everything had its order: peasants tilled, nobles ruled, priests prayed. A mason who built something breathtaking disrupted that order. He made stone seem alive, gravity seem negotiable. It was not heresy exactly, but it was close. So the legend filled the gap. If you built something divine, the story said, you must have bargained with the devil. It kept the world's logic intact. Mortals could not rival miracles without paying a price. And maybe that is what makes the Devil's Bridge myth both tragic and brilliant. It is not really about the devil. It is about how people made sense of innovation before they had language for it. In places like Luzerne in Switzerland, locals pointed to a single perfect arch spanning the Reuss River and whispered that Satan himself had carried the stones. In France, one version of the story said the devil demanded the soul of the builder's mother instead of a dog. The man tricked him by leading a cat across, draped in a shawl. The crowd cheered. Evil was outwitted, but the bridge remained beautiful, uncanny, and slightly cursed. You can feel the tension in that paradox. They admired the bridge enough to keep it, but feared it enough to name it after hell. The structure itself became a confession, we made this, but we should not have been able to. Modern historians trace these bridges to the 12th and 13th centuries, when engineering was leaping forward. Masons had learned how to shape keystones, distribute weight, and use lime mortar that hardened underwater. To the medieval eye, it was alchemy. Water should not obey stone, and yet here it did. The builders left no blueprints, only marvels. Over time, as literacy spread and religion softened, people forgot the techniques but kept the tales. When later generations stared at those arches and could not imagine how they were made, they resurrected the old excuse, the devil must have built it. There is something deeply human in that reflex. When faced with mystery, we fill it with story. It is not ignorance. It is instinct. Even now, we do it. We invent ghosts for coincidences, conspiracies for complexity, magic for mathematics. We would rather believe in deals with devils than in the slow, unseen patience of skill. The Devil's Bridge myth also says something about pride. In many versions, the builder who tricks the devil is not celebrated, he is haunted. Sometimes the bridge collapses. Sometimes he disappears. The moral was clear, challenge the divine order, and you will pay eventually. And yet, centuries later, those bridges still stand. Their stones have outlived their curses. Travelers cross them without fear, their feet echoing where the devil once demanded his due. The superstition fades, but the wonder remains. It is easy to see why these stories lasted. They speak to the thin line between reverence and rebellion. The medieval mind lived in both worlds, terrified of offending heaven, yet compelled to create beauty that reached for it. Every arch was a prayer disguised as defiance. When you stand beneath one of those bridges today, the air cool and damp, you can almost hear both voices, the murmur of the mason shaping stone by hand, and the whisper of the crowd calling it witchcraft. The truth, of course, is that the devil did not build them. People did. Ordinary craftsmen, hauling rock and sand, trusting geometry they did not yet have words for. They built because they wanted to cross, but also because they wanted to leave something that would last. And in that quiet defiance, that hunger to touch the impossible, they made art so perfect it frightened them. Maybe that is what all the old legends were trying to say. Not that the devil lurks in invention, but that awe itself feels dangerous. When humans reach too high, we tremble not from guilt, but from recognition. We know we are capable of more than we should be. So the Devil's Bridge is not really a warning. It is a mirror. A reminder that the line between miracle and mastery is thinner than we like to admit. The next time you cross one of those arches, pause halfway. Look down at the river. Steady and relentless. Look up at the curve of stone holding you aloft, each block resting on invisible math. Then ask yourself, what is more miraculous, that people once thought the devil built it, or that they believed beauty always demands a bargain. Either way, the bridge still stands. And maybe that is the real answer. The only true deal humanity ever made was with time itself. When you step back from all these stories, the dancers collapsing in Strasbourg, the dead pope on trial, the bleeding bread, the tangled rats, the holy wells, the curses, the beaked doctors, the skeletons, the vampires, the devil's bridges, they begin to rhyme. What once looked like madness starts to form a kind of pattern. The Middle Ages were not really dark. They were luminous with confusion. People were not stupid. They were earnest. They wanted the world to make sense, and when it did not, they built meaning from whatever they had: a miracle, a superstition, a whisper of science. Every absurd ritual was an act of hope disguised as fear. When we laugh at them now, it is mostly nervous laughter. Because deep down, we recognize ourselves. We still turn coincidence into fate, we still name our fears so they will sit still. The language has changed: bacteria instead of demons, algorithms instead of omens, but the reflex is ancient. The Middle Ages were never about ignorance. They were about intimacy. The dead were close, the divine was closer, and every cracked bell or cloud of dust could mean something. Their world was smaller, but their imagination was infinite. And maybe that is what draws us back. Not the horror, but the honesty. They did not hide their fear behind irony or reason. They painted it, prayed to it, made music out of it. Their superstition was just faith without filters, messy, human, and alive. So as we close this journey through their strange logic, maybe the lesson is not to feel superior, but to feel seen. Because the line between us and them is thin as breath, as thin as a bridge stone laid in the dark by hands that just wanted something to hold. Thank you for wandering back through the medieval mind tonight, through its ghosts, its miracles, its mistakes, and its quiet genius. If you are still here at the end, I hope you carry a little of that wonder with you, the kind that asks not just what is true, but why we need it to be. I will see you in the next story, where history gets a little clearer, but people never do.